It's a big pleasure to be with Anastasia and Henrique today. They've written a book about punishment, which I think is one of those philosophical issues that kind of just hits here. It's one of those things that's universal. It's one of those things that people connect deeply with because of a sense of justice or a sense of injustice, which you two write about so well in the book, because of some personal relationship to it, because of the fact we were all children at school once who probably got punished at some time or another, or maybe we've punished maybe because of our connection to the criminal justice system as well. So I think it's a really it's one of those fundamental questions for me. So I'm really excited to be getting into it with you. And when I received your book, I was just kind of looking at all the titles and just so excited that you know, this idea was being picked apart, because it's a big preoccupation of mine also. So to get into it, I was thinking as I was reading your book about visiting prison as a child, visiting family in prison, and this kind of sense I came away with, that sort of, if only people knew what it was like somewhere in somewhere like that, if only people had the knowledge, if you could sort of lift people out of their ignorance, then they might just be less sort of punitive. Or if only you could show people how sort of ineffective these places are, then people might be less punitive. But 30 years on, the prison population has more than doubled in the country where I live. And one thing you get into in the book is trying to explain that. And you say that even when we're shown how ineffective punishment can be, or how morally compromised it is, it maintains this kind of allure for us. It's still attractive. We still go to that punitive logic. Can you say more about that, and why it is that punishment has such an allure?
Should I start? Well, first of all, thanks very much. Thank you very much to Anthony and the philosopher for organizing this, and thanks a lot to Andy for agreeing to take this on and chat with us about this. This is a really great privilege and quite daunting in a way. Okay, so I mean, this is a really great question, which I think is at the heart of what we've been trying to do in our work for quite a while now, and that we hope that the book kind of crystallizes these efforts. And so yeah, I guess the main question we started with was almost like, why do we seem to really need or want punishment to work, even though it's clear in so many ways that it doesn't, or that it's deeply problematic, right? Why do we always seem to start from this notion that, but we need this, we need whatever happens, this is something important to society, it's something necessary, something akin to justice, or that justice requires. And we felt this was a very important question that I guess is, I mean, it's neglected in scholarship to some extent, right? I mean, there is scholarship that try to engage with this, that definitely that has highlighted the problems with punishment, but to us there was something missing. There was probably more intimately related to this emotional connection with punishment, emotional connection to the idea that punishment is useful, right? And it seems just to mention that I think anyone who has had some contact with I guess the lived experience or the reality of punishment or of I guess the carceral state probably feels this, well, boy, if only other people knew, right? But it's really interesting how in many ways we live in a time where information about punishment and information about the problems around punishment is very widespread, right? Documentaries, movies, lots of information online, etc. And yet, even though you might say there are more instances of contestation, still the structure around the dynamics of punitiveness and punishment don't seem to be very much affected by that. And I guess part of what I think knowledge is necessary, it's important, but people need to connect to what is it that they are knowing, right? What is it that they are experiencing when they see that? And this connection, this shift of how do we relate to the role and the plate of punishment in society is something that goes, I guess, a bit deeper, that kind of requires us to change, really change the way, not only the way we engage, I guess, with what we're seeing, if that makes sense.
That emotional attachment that you speak about to punishment, what is that? Where does that come from? What's it made of?
So, if I can come in, is that okay, Henrique? Yeah.
Okay.
But first of all, thank you so much, Andy and Anthony, for this invitation. It's really great to be here. So, I mean, what we are trying to get at in the book is to suggest that our desire for punishment and to see punishment as necessary is quite great, particularly because we live in societies that are quite emotionally fragmented and alienated. We are arguably in a position where we feel we need more punishment precisely because we are living in a very anxious moment, socially speaking, politically speaking. We're living in societies, I won't even say communities, that are quite fragmented, that are quite insecure in many ways, and that find opportunities to ultimately feel very isolated. And so there is a certain kind of individualized way of living and being that promotes this sense of insecurity and anxiety in our societies. So this emotional allure to say that all of these things that I'm feeling, all this negativity, all this badness that I'm feeling can be blamed on someone else is something that is particularly pertinent in certain societies like ours. So in saying that punishment is emotionally driven, we're also in a way suggesting that there is hope that we can change or alter those emotions as well, potentially, right?
So anxiety is a big part of that emotion, feelings of instability, sort of wanting to see a group or individual punished, perhaps, out of that sort of anxiety. When I was writing my book, I spoke to my brother about a lot of the stories he'd sort of got from being in prison or just being living a very chaotic life. And this isn't actually a prison story, but I think it connects so much to stories of punishment. He told me about a moment where he'd sort of become involved with a lot of very dangerous people and owed them money. And one of his kind of street mates was put in a car and the doors were locked, and there was a dog that was just so kind of big and wound up in there. And they were all outside the car. Everyone else was outside the car laughing. And he told me this story, and I said, you know, you were laughing. Did you find that funny? And he said, no, but if you don't laugh, then you're next. And you know, I sort of think about the glee that we can take in punishment, the delight, you know, as Nietzsche says, at moments of punishment, there is often something carnivalesque. There's a kind of celebration happening. You can still see it at executions and death row and things like that, but I think you can also see it in the UK when we get news of sentences getting tougher and the justice system becoming more punitive. that kind of anxiety, that kind of, I could be next if I don't sort of laugh or something. It's so kind of toxic. And I wonder what you think the kind of, what do we do if we are in a place of anxiety and instability, you know, economically, culturally, socially, politically, or whatever? How do we get past that? Or how do we make that? How do we not become gratuitously kind of punitive in that state? Does that make sense?
Gosh, yeah, no, it does. It's a well, it's a really important, but I guess really difficult question, right? I guess one way to think about it is why is a punitive reaction or response so attractive, right? And I guess one thing is that it, to some extent, it provides an escape from the anxiety, even if it's, as we suggest, at least a temporary or illusory escape, right? So it's all these things that I'm feeling, they are someone else's fault, and if only we manage to condemn, to punish them, things can be better, right? But this inculcated in this message is also the idea that this feeling that the world is senseless, that this feeling of uncertainty that I'm having is itself illusory, because the world actually makes sense, right? There is order, there is justice. The problem is that order has been disturbed by these dangerous orders, right? All we need to do is to tackle these dangerous orders, and then everything will be fine, right? So it's almost like in a way, a painkiller, right? That gets you engaged in a frame of feeling and a social imagination that kind of takes you away, or may take you away, or at least channel your feelings outwards, right? And the other thing is that this idea that we discuss a lot in our work, the idea of hostile solidarity, right? That I think is very, very nicely encapsulated by your story, right? If I don't laugh, I'm next, right? So by laughing, you belong, right? You suddenly are in this realm of safety, or in the case of punishment institutionally and morally, you are in the side of right? You're in the side of the good guys, but this solidarity, this engine for solidarity, always works through antagonism, right? Through aggression, by pitting the us against them, right? And interestingly, I guess there's always this moment of anxiety. If I'm not in, then I may be out, right? Then I may be targeted. So it's an additional incentive, I guess, to perpetuate punitiveness, to be always pursuing punitive logics.
Just to add to that, actually, there's some really interesting research on punitive attitudes that's suggesting, I think that speaks a little bit to that story about if I don't laugh, then I'm next, that research is suggesting that actually some of the more punitive cohorts in our population are people who, for example, might come from very precarious backgrounds, or from the working class, for instance. Or we know prisoners are often known to be expressing very punitive views themselves. So there is, I think, an interesting relationship between feeling that you might be next and expressing these kinds of hostile feelings of punitiveness, right?
Yeah,
So it's about a kind of hostile solidarity. That's one of the things we get out of punishment, a feeling of us and them, that we're sort of safe in the us, that we're secure somehow, when actually it's because things are uncertain, things are anxious, sort of socially, politically.
Yeah, and I guess that being the us is a desirable place to be, right? And this point that Anastasia just made, I guess, reminds me of Bridget Anderson's idea of in her book Us and Them. She talks about how to some extent, the more fragile your place is in the community of value, the more you feel like you need to reinforce that you do belong, you're in, right? Because you are very dangerously close to the boundaries of that community. So that, I guess, can perhaps explain a bit why sometimes people who can be more exposed to punitive logics can also be very punitive themselves.
Yes, it's an ongoing question for me, actually, the work I do teaching in prison, that often the people I'm with in the class who are prisoners will have a much more punitive worldview than I do, and yet they've encountered a lot more punishment than I have. And finding a point of connection in that is interesting, because I'm not sure if their position puts them in a place of greater wisdom and experience, you know, with where they are, what they've been through, or whether they've so much been spoken to in that mode, you know, they've so much been treated with a punitive logic that it's sort of harder for them to imagine a world outside of that. I don't know what your thoughts are about that, sort of that encounter between the philosopher who's imagining a world beyond punishment, as I am and as you are, and prisoners who are saying, you know, we need longer sentences.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think in some, at least in some degree, it is the only world that prisoners know. It is the only logic that they've been exposed to, as you say, and in a way, it kind of makes sense. If you have been treated in this punitive, hostile way all your life, you will. That's what you know, right? That's what you will perform yourself. It is also a kind of coping strategy. I think that's what we're trying to argue when thinking about punishment as an emotionally alluring process. It's a kind of coping strategy to say that I am going to be punitive towards X or Y because they have committed that type of crime, or because they are that kind of person, because that enables that prisoner as well to place themselves in the community of value, to become a good or a better prisoner themselves. It enables them an opportunity to come in the side of the so-called good, at least even for a moment, right? So it is, again, a practice of an urge to belong, even temporarily, in that community, right?
Yes, I can see that. So it may be that punishment maintains an allure not just for the punishers, but for the punished as well. You know, even when it's experienced so harshly, and maybe it provides order, maybe it provides a belonging to the us. There's a part of your book called From Pain to Punitiveness, where you talk about something that you call the pathology of justice, and this is a really, really interesting idea. It's about the body and about justice. I think you draw on Drew Leader's work. You say there's something similar about how we experience our body and how we experience justice, in that we only really become cognizant of them when they sort of break. we only, most of the time, become aware of our bodies when we're ill or injured, and justice, we mostly take it for granted unless there's an injustice, in which case we become very, very aware of justice. Can you say more about that connection and where that connection takes us, in terms of what role it might play in why we punish the way we do?
Sure. Trying to think. I mean, I guess it's thinking about the relationship between punishment and pain. I mean, in a way, it's a very productive stuff, because I guess even the two words are very intimately related, right? But I mean, what really, I guess, we try to take from these discussions on the philosophy of embodiment, right, is this idea that we tend phenomenologically, I guess, especially even more so in contemporary liberal societies, to take our bodies for granted and to see them mainly as either an obstacle to us, like when they hurt, when our body hurts, and we tend to see something, or we need to do something about it, or to see them as projects, right? Something that we can improve. I need to lose weight. I need to eat better, or whatever. I need to. So it's this idea that unless the body becomes something of an inconvenience or something that needs to be fixed, we're not aware of it, right? And we thought about, well, in many ways, punitive logics, punitive justice has a similar logic, in the sense that we tend to take justice for granted. We tend to assume that, we have laws, we have society, we know how a good society is or should be, and justice only becomes a problem when there is something that needs to be fixed, but this something is usually something episodic, right? A crime happens, so we need to deal with the crime, right? As soon as the crime is dealt with, as soon as the person responsible is found and they are punished, then we go back to our usual state, right? And we thought that this is interesting because in many ways it's deeply problematic, because it takes for granted not only the structural dimension of harm, how to some extent we may be perpetuating harm. It's not only the crime that was the problem, but the crime was itself a product or something. But we tend more broadly, I guess, to be, well, punitive justice encourages us, I guess our argument is more, to be oblivious to the ways in which justice can infuse a much more broader sphere of social action, right? So I guess when we're thinking about that and thinking, so what do we do about it? We engage with the work of people like Iris Marion Young to try and think about, we need to think of justice as an everyday practice, right? It's not something that only happens when we see a crime in front of us and we need to deal with it. And once we reach a verdict or a sentence, then the issue is resolved. But rather, it's something that we must be constantly producing, constantly practicing. And by we mean everyone, right? Not simply the justice system. It's not a problem that we can simply defer, I guess. So sorry.
So it sounds like you're saying justice isn't just something that's not happening, and justice and injustices are happening all the time, and punishment draws our attention away from punishing individuals, draws our attention away from structural injustices that might explain how those individuals ended up committing crime. Am I going in the right direction with that thought?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so it's by focusing on, simple, I guess, example. Now, you can, by thinking that the main problem of migration and illegal migration is the smugglers who benefit from a trade of transporting people into the UK, etc., and saying that the main thing we need to do is to stop their trade and to punish them and to send them away or something like that. We are completely unaware of the fact that this is not only a much more complicated problem that will not go away simply through punitive attitudes and responses, but also it, very importantly, I guess, to us, is that it neglects the fact that we live with this problem in our everyday lives. We cannot think that just by changing the law or adding a new barrier or a new dimension of border control that will resolve this problem, because this problem is really embedded into the fabric of British society, right? And we're all in a way part of it. Right? I don't know if that makes sense as an example.
Yeah, I think that's I mean, the idea in that last chapter and in the paper that precedes it is to suggest that injustice is everywhere around us. It's just we are comfortable being oblivious to it unless it suddenly matters to us personally, unless it hurts us individually. And when that happens, what we seek is a kind of a placebo. It's a kind of painkiller punishment, a kind of a ritual of criminal justice, something that will make us feel better in that immediate kind of way that doesn't actually take away the chronic pathology of the injustice in the first place, or of the injustice that produced the crime in the first place, right? So for us, the metaphor of the body kind of brings us nicely into a way of thinking of justice as almost a medical problem, as a chronic pathology, as a condition that we're not taking seriously. We're not pursuing, to use a criminological term, any treatment for it that might be long-lasting or effective, but in the contrary, we're seeking a quick fix, a pain-killing kind of pill that might make us feel good while it's happening, but will keep perpetuating the injustice that brought it in the first place.
So another one of the reasons that punishment might maintain its allure is it's for the same reasons that painkillers maintain their allure. We can't seem to fix the underlying problem, either because we don't know how, or maybe, as we'll perhaps come on to talk about, there's a deeper injustice at play there. For someone looking at the title of your book, Questioning Punishment, they might think that you're sort of questioning justice as well, and that maybe the fear is that if we didn't punish people, then society would be chaotic and there'd be no sense of fairness or justice or merit. But clearly, speaking to you and reading your book, you're really driven by a sense of justice here. But think that there are really big and troubling questions about punitive logic. So I guess I want to know, in sort of positive terms, what would our lives look like? What would the world look like if we cared about justice, but rejected a punitive logic?
I don't know. I mean, I guess that'll be the simple question. Gosh, I really don't know, but I think there are so many dimensions, I guess, to this question. One is that, I mean, we don't engage in the book with, for instance, with abolitionism, I guess, as a movement or as a set of ideas. Well, I think there are lots of synergies between what we're talking about and an abolitionist perspective. But I guess our focus is much more on trying really to understand what is this problem, why is punishment is such a dominant mode, cultural mode, I guess, in our societies now, and in so doing, try to problematize it, to basically allow us to not take it for granted, and but at the same time, I guess there are two things we're probably not doing. I don't know if Anastasia will agree with me. First is that we're not essentializing punishment either as a bad thing, as something that, you know, it's the evil of the world, let's get rid of it and everything's fine. The problem is the place that punishment has been given in our imaginaries of justice, of society, of ourselves, of our identity. That's the problem, right? That's what we want to really question, and we feel it needs to go away, right? So maybe there would be a place for punishment. I don't know, because we need to get there. First of all, I guess it's part of our argument is that we need to come to terms that we don't even know really what justice might look like, right? We just need to know that the way we're doing it now is problematic, wrong, and needs to change, right? I guess that's the main step, so to speak, right? But obviously, if we take an anti-institutional perspective, you might say that there are already good examples of, practices about justice that can challenge or can provide alternatives, right? There are many groups that deal with, for instance, transformative justice efforts that I think can provide very interesting illustrations of how the same problems we're concerned about can be dealt with. They don't need to be neglected, but through other means. Or even the idea that, I don't want to romanticize the idea of family environment, but one reason why we discuss, for instance, punishment is so naturalized is that we tend to conflate. We don't separate enough ideas of institutional punishment from, for instance, the idea that if someone does something wrong, you can try to chastise them or to punish them, and that's natural, right? And many people will feel it's something that they even need to do in an educational environment, in a family environment, etc. But obviously, when the situation is right, and it's not always right, probably quite the contrary, but in a good familial environment, even when parents decide to punish their child, to try and, when it's in an environment of love and of really care and concern, then a practice that could be constituted of punishment would look fundamentally different, right, than what happens in a completely depersonalized, institutionalized environment, which is what you can find in a prison today. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Add anything to that?
Can I just add? I mean, I think someone in the chat I saw earlier asked what do we mean by punitive logic, and I think that's actually a really important question. I think it's not just the logic or the discourse of the practice of being hostile towards someone, but for me at least, engaging in a punitive logic involves always blaming someone else, always looking at another and saying that person did X and Y, and therefore X and A, B, C needs to happen. For me, therefore, a practice or an attempt to pursue justice in a non-punitive way might begin by thinking that the problem might be with us to start with, that we need to kind of to engage in an inward-looking exercise. And even in a non-institutional setting, in the family setting, in the example that Henrique just described, that should also be an inward-looking exercise. Why is my child acting up? How have I contributed to that behavior to start with? And what's the place of a disciplinary or a punitive response within this loving kind of restorative context? So I think the idea of a non-punitive approach to justice is one that actually appreciates that we are at the heart of injustice. It's not someone else. It's not always another community or someone else aside from us, but we are actually fully responsible for the conditions in our society, and we need to take that responsibility forward. So in a way, a non-punitive approach to justice is not to say that, oh yeah, we're putting the wrong people in prison and we need to look at the politicians and the corporations, because that's still a punitive approach, right? It's actually about us taking responsibility about the conditions that brought us in the place that we are now, and thinking ahead about how do we move away from this entire way of thinking and practicing this kind of hostile practices.
So true to your title, it's about questioning at those moments where there's it would seem natural or normal or necessary to punish. There may just be a process of reflection on ourselves, on the structural conditions. I have so many questions that I want to get into. There's so many interesting things about your book, especially a chapter about who we punish, which talks about race, talks about gender, talks about failed masculinities, which is another big idea I'd love to get into another time. But I'm aware that we've got less than 20 minutes left, and the chat is really lively, and I'm sure there's some great questions from people online as well. So Anthony, would you be okay to take us to questions, please?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And yeah, there are some really great questions popping in. Anastasia's already addressed Sarah's one about punitive logic. So I think I will just well, I'll start with the first one that came in from Alice, who says, "Thank you so much for this conversation. You've explored lots of great ideas, but I'm keen to hear which thinkers, philosophers or not, were especially influential in writing your book and why." So obviously you mentioned Iris Marion Young earlier, so she may be a central protagonist. So Anastasia, do you wanna start with maybe one person who's especially influential for you, and maybe Henrique can do one, then Andy, I'm sure you've got your own preferred punishment theorists.
God, this is actually a simple question, but a really difficult one to answer. Actually, we had our book launch at the University of Warwick a few months ago, and we had a discussant who basically said we just merged and mixed so many different disciplines and ideas in this single book that I think we made a bit of a hopefully a comprehensive mix. But yeah, I think in a way, Henrique coming from a sociolegal, more philosophical background, me coming from a more sociological background, we brought different inspirations and different authors together and put them, attempted at least to put them in conversation. I think the first kind of interesting kind of inspirational, if you like, scholar that we contemplated more than 10 years ago was in the work of Durkheim, who is obviously a very important figure in the sociology of punishment. And I think our project together started as an attempt to deconstruct Durkheim's perspective on punishment and on solidarity. From then on, I think in some ways, my interests are somewhat different to those of Henrique. So I have an interest in kind of more post-structuralist perspectives on punishment, Foucault, for example. And then I think Henrique perhaps has a slightly different approach to Foucault altogether, but I will let you speak to that.
There I go next. I like Foucault. It's very difficult to think about the one philosopher, but I guess one thing that really, well, it kind of inspired the first article we wrote about this was actually David Hume, where we read this essay by him called "Why Utility Pleases." And it's funny because it's a very, I think, unusual place to start, or even philosopher to engage with in this area. But his discussion about how we tend to think that we pursue utility because it's a rational thing. We always trying to maximize utility because it's good for us, etc. Is mistaken. And actually, the main reason why we pursue utility is because utility pleases, because it makes us feel good about it. That when we say something's useful, it makes us feel really nice that we're doing it, right? And we thought, well, that's just perfect. And it was such a moment of like threshold concept moment, to use a pedagogic term, that I think it was really influential, and that's why we even named our first paper after his essay. We called it "Why Punishment Pleases." So I think it was a very, very productive, unusual engagement with philosophy that really drove our inquiry.
Brilliant. Yeah, Andy.
I feel
what do
a
you think?
teenager in the room for saying this, but for me it was Kafka. I mean, he's a kind of companion throughout my book, who I feel very ambivalent about, actually, and that ambivalence is part of the story. But I suppose what's interesting in Kafka, in books like The Trial, and so many of his stories that are about punishment, is it's untethered from the crime. The details of the crime can come later. It's he's guilty and he's going to be punished, and everything else is just a footnote. So by doing that, I think Kafka takes us into, gives us a very particular lens on the authoritarian dynamics of punishment.
Okay, so yeah, there's loads of great questions. Let's move on to Catherine's question. She starts by thanking you for the valuable discussion, and then asks, could you please speak to the phenomenon of violent collective punishment as enacted by states? So the phenomenon of violent collective punishment as enacted by states. I'm not sure, Henrique or Anastasia, if that phrase jumps out at one of you more than the other. Feel free to step in.
Well, it's because it relates to my work, I guess, but the first thing that came to mind as an illustration of that is this doctrine of joint enterprise that's been very prevalent in discussions in the UK. There's basically this legal doctrine that allows the state to charge and convict numbers of people just on the basis that they were engaged in a joint enterprise. They were committing crimes together, basically, and this has been pervasively used to criminalize young urban Black populations on the idea that they form gangs or they are involved in gang violence, and I think this is, to me at least, a very good illustration, because it gets people who basically didn't contribute almost at all to the main crime, which usually is murder, and then they get given life sentences on the basis that they get constructed as gangsters or gang members, right? So for me, that's a very violent form of collective punishment. And I mean, there are many things you can say about that, but to me, this links a lot with the idea of punishment as a boundary maintenance exercise, right? So the reason why it can be very effectively applied collectively against collectivity, it's because it's easy to get certain traits and to link them with images of otherness, images of dangerousness. And this is part of how punishment operates, right? What we called about the symbolic apparatus of punishment being a scapegoating ritual, basically. Then we need to find an ideal, an adequate scapegoat that is able to receive all our angst, all our anger, and that can be sacrificed, basically, in the name of order. So yeah, so I think it's part of how punishment operates. It's through the identification. There are all these images, right? These characterizations in punishment that they are quite usefully deployed to enable, to facilitate this scapegoating dynamics. That makes sense.
Thanks. Anastasia or Andy, would you like to add anything to Catherine's questions or Henrique's response?
I mean, yeah, I guess I can very briefly say, yeah, in the chapter in the book, we call it who do we target and who are the subjects of punishment. I think we are quite keen to clarify that punishment is not random, right? It's not applied randomly or equally to all of us or any of us. It targets particular communities, particular populations, particular groups of people, and in that sense, from a more critical sociological perspective, we might see it as a very concrete form of state violence against particular communities or collectives or groups of people. And we see that being especially particular around, its targeting of marginalized communities, racialized communities, of particularly fragile communities in terms of economic opportunities, educational opportunities. We're seeing an over representation of neurodivergent people in prison. So there are particular cohorts of prison who are especially exposed to criminalization. And in that sense, we might see punishment as a violent practice against particular groups of people, for sure.
Super. So there's a nice cluster of questions emerging around individual responsibility and things, and I will turn to them, but I like this slightly provocative, intriguing question from Sarah, who asks, I'm interested to know if your position implies there are no evil people. So I'm not sure if the wide disciplinary scope of your book encompasses moral psychology, if that's where that question may be classified. But I was wondering if either of you wanted to say anything to Sarah's question.
I don't think, I guess one thing I'll say, I don't think our book is actually in many ways concerned about the actual judgment of morality over people's actions. We're much more concerned about punishment as a social phenomenon, not in itself. I think obviously the moral dimension is very important. From a personal perspective, I would be very tempted to say, yeah, I don't think there are any evil people. I don't think there is. It's very useful to characterize people in that sense as evil. I think people can do things that are very terrible, and we need to deal with. We can't just excuse all sorts of harm or violence. Something has to be done. The problem is whether punishment is actually an adequate way of dealing with harm, especially the kind of punitive practices that we have today. We need to ask ourselves so many questions about, can we actually even adequately identify who's responsible or who isn't for certain kinds of crime? Do we know exactly how to apportion this responsibility? Is imprisonment or are the kinds of penalties and charges that we utilize today an adequate response to them? And is this system as a whole, does this work in a way that's actually geared towards addressing the morality of harm, or is it doing something else entirely? I think those are the main questions that I think are at the core of what we try to do.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Andy. Go.
You go first, please.
No, I was just going to say, I think, as Henrique says, it's not a subject that we cover in the book, as our focus is more on how we respond through punishment and what that means for us, socially speaking. But I've just spent the past few months interviewing prison officers, probation officers, people who work in prisons, and I think it's a topic that has come up in various conversations. I think I would agree. I don't think it's about evil people, but certain actions being obviously very harmful, very violent. So it's about conduct potentially being evil or being seen as evil, but it is also about social conditions enabling certain actions to take place that might be terrible or evil. Certain structures of domination and of oppression allowing certain forms of violence to be perpetuated. Say, for example, patriarchy, we might say, enables forms of sexual violence to be prevalent, right? So I'm not so sure that it's helpful to think about certain people or individuals or even behaviors as evil, but it's perhaps, in my mind at least, more helpful to think about actions as potentially harmful or violent, and as these actions being driven or generated partly by certain structural systems that are kind of enabling them and allowing them to continue.
I doubt I can add much insight beyond the two excellent comments we've just heard here, but I think it's good to be lucid to the fact that some people have the capacity to do real harm and abuse to other people. We shouldn't be blithe about that. Whether that means we have to say that people are evil, I don't think it does. And I think there's a lot that we don't understand yet about how people work, how they operate psychologically, socially. And the word evil, I think it sort of puts a full stop on our understanding, when actually there's a lot more exploration to do. So I feel like the term evil shuts down conversation when, to keep the title of your book, we need to keep questioning punishment, questioning evil. We need to keep learning to keep the situation, to keep growing. Yeah.
Super. Well, we're pretty much at time, but there's a few questions here from Alice, Rachel, and Ian, which kind of dovetail a little bit with each other, perhaps less. Well, maybe I'll put Rachel's question to Anastasia with the understanding that it will have to go with a sort of short, punchy answer rather than the kind of fleshed out answer that the question deserves. So Rachel's question is, how can theories on affect and feminist solidarity pave the way towards a change in punitive attitudes? Do you fancy having a short answer to that?
I don't know if I can give a short answer to this. This is a very complicated and emotional issue, I think. I think certainly feminist politics leave a lot of promise for us to think about non-punitive, non-carceral ways forward. The kind of feminist politics that I'm especially interested in is a politics that prioritizes the expertise of lived experience, that gives voice to the marginalized, that kind of wants to recognize and fully act upon those that are oppressed and kind of at the margins of society. And that, of course, covers issues of gendered injustice, but also of other forms of injustice. But unfortunately, for me at least, we have also seen feminist approaches to justice be very punitive, at least from my perspective, in my view. And so I think simply espousing a feminist politics is not necessarily going to take you towards a non-punitive approach to justice. It is about thinking, I think, quite deeply about the kind of feminism we want to pursue if we are to move beyond that kind of punitive approach to justice. There's more I could say, but I think this is a longer conversation.
That was great for the sort of as a pithy answer. So, Henrique, I guess to sort of merge together the last couple of questions, let's go with what role do you think there is for individual responsibility in a world without or with reduced punishment?
I think there's a very significant role for that, actually. I mean, some work I engage with and I've worked on actually thinks that problem is not with individual responsibilities, problem is with how it's operationalized in the law. The law has a very essentialized understanding of individual responsibility. And some work, a colleague of mine, Craig Reeves, talks about this difference between holding responsible and taking responsibility, right? As two different modes of engaging with this question, for instance, right? To hold someone responsible is to simply put the blame on them and kind of almost foreclose any proper question of how to move forward. Whereas taking responsibility is much more of a taking in, an acceptance, an idea of using responsibility as a vehicle for change, not only for changing of someone's even understanding of what they've done and how to behave in the world, but also I think it opens a possibility for a much more collective approach to responsibility. And I guess part of what the book is about is all about responsibility, but all about saying maybe we as members of society and as societies have been denying our responsibility about many issues related to crime and punishment. And this is something that we need to take really seriously moving forward. So I think there's a big role to play, but again, we need to question responsibility as well before we can move forward.